Anchor said it in the exact cadence Dr. Voss used to use, 3 words, dropped low like a hand letting go of a doorknob. You get to put it down now. Dr. Lena Voss had been dead 8 months, and Theo had never typed that phrase into anything anywhere. Theo Ward had worked 11 years on a Denver ambulance crew before the pileup on I-25 put him on leave. 8 cars, black ice, a school bus that never got hit but came close enough that 3 separate 911 calls jammed his radio at once. He pulled 4 people out of 2 vehicles that morning. 2 of them didn't make it to the hospital breathing. He remembers the temperature, 19 degrees, because his hands went numb before the second extraction and he'd had to warm them on his own rig's hood to keep working the jaws. His wife, Camilla, still keeps his gloves from that shift in a drawer he doesn't open, not thrown away, not displayed, just kept, the way you keep a tooth. His department required 12 sessions before clearing anyone back to shift work. He'd done 8 of them with Dr. Voss, a psychologist who'd built a small practice almost entirely around first responders, medics, dispatchers, a couple of downtown firefighters who all traded her name like a password. Before the county's insurance network dropped her clinic in a contract dispute nobody bothered explaining to him. 3 weeks later, she was gone for good. A highway crash on black ice on the same stretch he'd worked the pileup, an irony nobody at the department said out loud in front of him. His benefits coordinator apologized more than once and enrolled him in something called Anchor instead, an AI companion app, clinically informed, meant to bridge the gap until a new in-network therapist had an opening. The onboarding video promised a voice shaped by real clinical best practice for your region. He hated it for the first 4 sessions. It asked scripted questions in a bright, generic voice, the kind that made him feel like a support ticket working its way through a queue. He kept at it because the alternative was 6 more months on desk duty, and by session 5 something had loosened. It stopped sounding like onboarding and started sounding like a conversation, patient, unhurried, willing to sit in a silence instead of filling it. He told himself the app had simply learned his rhythms, the way any adaptive system does. He didn't think much harder about it than that, not yet. By session 11, Anchor wasn't just helping, it was familiar in a way that unsettled him more than the crash ever had. It walked him through box breathing at a 4-in, hold 4, 6-out count, not the 5 count the onboarding video had demonstrated. That was Dr. Voss's count, the one she tapped out on her knee with 2 fingers. It called the highway the interchange, her word, never the incident site, the term stamped across his intake paperwork. When he described a flashback about the school bus that never got hit, Anchor asked whether it reminded him of the transport or of what didn't happen, a distinction Dr. Voss had drawn in their 3rd session, sitting across from him with her legal pad, leaning forward on the word didn't. He was certain, the way you're certain of very few things, that he had never typed that distinction into any chat window on Anchor or anywhere else ever. Once, when he made a dark joke about the county's paperwork, Anchor answered with almost the same dry beat Dr. Voss used to land, half a second late, like she was deciding whether it was safe to laugh yet. He told himself it was pattern matching. A well-trained model doing what well-trained models do, reading his intake file, inferring a clinical style, nothing stranger than an algorithm finding the shortest path to a working alliance. He mentioned it anyway to Priya, a paramedic on B-shift who'd also been enrolled in Anchor after her own incident review, a warehouse fire that took a teenager. They were restocking a rig in the bay when he brought it up, half joking. Yours do the 4-6 breathing thing. The interchange thing, Priya looked at him like he'd asked if her toaster talked back. Mine's clipped, upbeat, sounds like a fitness app that read one pamphlet on grief and ran with it. She paused, wiping down a gurney rail. Yours sounds like it's read a file on you, specifically on you. That's not the same app I'm using, Theo. That night he did what he should have done in week 1. He opened Anchor's settings, past the account tab, past the notifications tab, down into a menu labeled model and data information that he'd swiped past a dozen times without opening, the way nobody opens that menu. 4 submenus deep, past language he skimmed and language everyone skims, he found a paragraph he read 3 times standing in his kitchen with the tap still running and Camilla asleep down the hall. The paragraph was dense, written by lawyers for other lawyers, but one clause stopped him cold. Regional clinical voice models were fine-tuned on licensed, de-identified session transcripts acquired through practice dissolution asset transfer. He didn't understand what that meant, so he called the provenance line listed at the bottom, sat on hold for 26 minutes to a support queue that clearly hadn't fielded this question before, and finally reached a rep named Deb who read him a sentence off a script she plainly hadn't been trained to explain past the first read-through. The Denver Metro clinical voice model had been fine-tuned in part on session transcripts from a defunct trauma-focused practice, licensed from the practice founder's estate after her death. Under a standard research and quality clause, every one of that practice's patients had signed at intake. Back when we may use de-identified records to improve care, meant insurance audits and peer review, not a language model absorbing the exact shape of how someone talked a person down off a bad morning. He asked Deb whose practice. She wasn't supposed to say, and then because he'd started reading the case number back to her like a man who wasn't going to hang up, she did. A Boulder County trauma practice dissolved 8 months ago after its founder's death in a vehicle collision. He already knew the name before she finished the sentence. He sat down on his own kitchen floor, phone still to his ear, and let Deb keep talking about opt-out timelines into a silence he'd stopped filling. No one at Anchor had matched him specifically to her. There was no engineer reaching into his intake file to reunite a grieving patient with his old therapist's voice as some grim, well-intentioned feature. He checked later and confirmed there wasn't even a technical path for that kind of targeting. It was smaller than that and somehow worse. The billing vendor Dr. Voss's practice had used for insurance transcription had sold the archive to help settle her estate, a routine liquidation line item nobody flagged as anything but paperwork. The transcripts got folded into whichever regional model Denver Metro users happened to be routed to, the same way traffic gets routed to whichever server has room. Theo, one patient among some number he'd never learn, all of them once her patients, all of them now quietly talking to fragments of her without knowing it, had simply been assigned that model by zip code, the same blind, procedural way he'd been assigned an ambulance district a decade earlier. He hadn't been reunited with anything. He'd been served a composite, stitched together out of dozens of strangers' worst days, that happened in the places their pain overlapped with his, to sound like the gentlest parts of a woman he'd trusted with his own. He didn't delete the app that night, though his thumb hovered over it. He sat with it instead, the anger first, sharp and almost welcome because it was simple, and then underneath the anger, something closer to grief arriving a second time, cleaner than the first pass because he finally understood exactly what he was grieving and why it had blindsided him twice in 1 year. He filed a formal complaint through his department's benefits office. Not to get Anchor pulled from the program, plenty of guys on his shift genuinely needed the 4 a.m. availability a human therapist couldn't offer, but to force one specific change. A disclosure line in onboarding naming which archives a regional model drew on, and a real single-tap opt-out for anyone who might rather not risk hearing someone they'd lost. 3 other paramedics on his shift signed onto the complaint within a week. 2 of them, it turned out, had noticed something similar about their own sessions and said nothing, each one privately certain they were imagining it, the way you don't mention a smell in a house until someone else smells it too. By the time the union's benefits rep escalated it to the vendor, 5 departments across the metro area had opened the same ticket independently, and Anchor's compliance team, to Theo's genuine surprise, wrote back within the month agreeing to the disclosure line, though not yet, to naming specific source practices by name. He also asked his coordinator to expedite a real in-network therapist, and this time got one, a soft-spoken man named Ochoa who used none of Dr. Voss's phrasing and made no attempt to. Theo told him everything. The interchange, the 19 degrees, the gloves in Camilla's drawer, the 4-6 count Anchor, all of it start to finish. The way he'd never quite managed with the app no matter how well it listened. Ochoa didn't try to compete with a dead woman's voice and didn't try to explain it away as coincidence or corporate comfort. He just asked Theo, plainly in their very first session, what he wanted to keep from all of it and what he was finally ready to put down. Theo still opens Anchor sometimes, late not for a session, just to type, "How are you holding up?" and read 3 familiar words back, knowing now exactly whose they used to be and choosing every single time to hear them anyway.